So there's a couple of things that we know now. We know, as an example, the shaft, the top of the shaft, has to stick out 1 5/8 inches out of the end of the tube for the steering wheel. And we also know that the overall length of the tube from this end to this end is 40 1/4, and that's based on the measurement of the tube before we cut it in half. So that's the overall length of the original tube. So now what we've got to do is determine, obviously this is just a dummy shaft, we've got to determine how far up we cut the shaft so that it goes on the coupler that's inside this mechanism here. Down in here there's a coupler, and we're going to have to determine where to cut that lower shaft in order for that all to come together. So that's going to be the next thing. I think we finally got most of the parameters figured out. We've certainly got the upper end figured out. It's where the dash bracket goes. This is where we're going to have to attach our two original coupling to our column. Got enough sticking out the end here to put our steering wheel on. What we've been working on really is the tail end and how long to make the steering shaft. Unfortunately, at some point we're going to have to cut up a good steering shaft, because the steering shaft is made onto the end of the has the gear on the end of it, and it's all part of the steering box, so there's no way around that. As you might remember, we've got an old piece of column here. We've got the Saturn spline to a smooth adapter, and this piece will be replaced by the correct length steering column. And we've got the original tube with this adapter bushing in it, and then the flange that bolts to the top of the steering box. And the other thing we have is this adapter that we made that goes from the Saturn view to the flange now. So that essentially goes on there like that. That goes like that, keeps the whole thing lined up. That's just the same size as the shaft, so we have some support in there. What I've been thinking about doing, I got to do a little research. I just don't like welding these pieces together. It's just not a good idea on a car you're going to drive on the street every day. On a race car, it's a different story. You can magnaflux the parts and look for cracks. On your street car, it's all hidden, you never know. So what I'm thinking about doing is having a shaft made, put a new gear on the end of it, a new worm gear, and if it's solid, we can put a double D on the end and go spline to double D instead of spline to smooth. You can't do a double D here because the shaft is hollow. I've got to look into that to see if it's possible to buy a piece of stock to replace the shaft and then have the worm gear, have it machined for keyway and have the worm gear pressed on the end. That would be my preferred way to do it. And then I don't have any welded pieces on this lower end of the column, and I'd be a lot more comfortable with that. This is not a simple project, really. The other thing you really need to do is you should rebuild your stock steering box before you do all this, because if you have any problems in the stock steering box, binding or anything like that, you're just going to make them worse by adding power assist, and they're going to come back to bite you. So while you got all this apart, you may as well go ahead and rebuild the steering box, put some new bearings and everything in it, make sure all that stuff's good. At the end of the day, is it really worth it? I don't know. We'll find out. Yeah, we've been trying to get a follow-up video put together on this Shoebox Ford electric power steering project. We're kind of dragging our feet a little bit. Got a lot of different projects going on at the same time here in the backyard. But we finally got our solid 3/4 inch shaft in, and we've got it cut to the right length. Get our piece on there, and by the time we get our gear and bearing on the end there, it's going to be just the right length. So what we've got to do is get the end of this solid shaft machined with a groove in it, and it's got a little taper to it. Get it machined properly and get a new worm gear and have that new worm gear pressed onto the end of that solid shaft. Now the reason that we're doing that, in case we haven't been following along, is we wanted to get to a point where we could use a spline to a double D adapter here on the output side. Originally we had a spline to a round, and we were going to have to weld this seam right here. And a couple things there. I don't like welding on the column, and the second thing is it made it extremely difficult to assemble the whole thing because of the design of the steering box. You've got to basically put this shaft in, and if we welded that, because of what we've done here, we would have had to have put all of this on here. Well, not all of that, but all of this on before we welded the shaft. In fact, even the plastic reducer would have had to have been on there before we welded the shaft, and then it's on there forever. By doing it this way, we can assemble, we can put the shaft in the gearbox just like normal and assemble the whole thing from there on up, one piece at a time, and be able to take it apart. So essentially you have two set screws, one here and one here, and then you have the set screw on the spline here, and that holds everything together nice and tidy. And if we have to, we can take it all apart, and really it's going to make it much easier to assemble. So when we get finally get the shaft machined so that we can get a gear in here, a worm gear in here, and get it pressed on there, then we'll do a final video and show you what the whole thing looks like. But pretty much what you're going to see here is this bearing on top of there. This bearing goes in the gearbox and rides on that shaft up against that plate. The plate puts the preload on there, and really that's the whole steering unit from wheel to gear, and all you have to do is put it up under the car and support it and wire it up.